Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to wrap up this week with an album review where we check out an entire album track by track, observing what each song is doing in isolation and its place within the larger work. Today we're going to be looking at a band called Haggard, specifically at their 1997 album And Thou Shalt Trust the Seer. Okay. I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of context for this. I'm going to look some up after we listen to this first track, see what I can find out about it through Wikipedia, and what's another? Genius tends to have some pretty good information about albums, but I do want to go in with as little knowledge as possible and just try to observe what's happening with this first track, which is called The Day as Heaven Wept. Chapter 1, which is interesting. We do have, out of the 8 tracks, 5 of them are titled as chapters. I'm assuming that they all work together in some larger scheme. The other 3 tracks, well, interestingly about them, 2 of them are listed as a type of music in a key. And the last one is a very short outro, just called A Midnight Gathering, which presumably would be some sort of prologue to the other chapters, and possibly the non-chapter titles are interludes. That's kind of my guess going into this based solely on titles. We only have 41 minutes of music across 8 songs. We're probably going to get through this rather quickly, but given that most of the tracks are a bit on the longer side, we should have some good discussion after each of the songs. Let's dive into this first one, The Day as Heaven Wept, and see what's going on with this. So we got some folk music here, that's neat. So we have the ritardando slowing the song down into this section where we had that unified melody line. Beautiful harmony there between our 2 violins. Adding a little bit of darkness right there in the progression. Very sharp tempo change. Beautiful ornamentation. What is this? This is gorgeous. So a little bit of folk, a little bit of classical, all smashed together with modern structure.
The scenery shows the ashes of some who tried to refuse
You know, I probably should have seen metal popping up somewhere in here. It would have been very cool though if we just had a folky classical album. Oh. That snare run was definitely a bit more folk. Interesting to hear it on the modern drum kit. Wild juxtaposition between all these different parts. I love the way the violin comes there against the guitars. We'll push forward. I have a lot of stuff I want to talk about, but I've taken lots of notes, so I'm not going to forget them. I want to see where this goes, though. So the last track bounced back and forth between 4/4 and 3/4. This one's kind of sticking within a 4/4 so far. Interesting drum parts. We've heard only a couple of sections I'd say were metronomic. Most of them are rather melodic. Some cool layered vocals there. Slight tempo increase. The organ's new. Same with the choir, though the choir and organ make sense together. They move out of ideas really quickly. Interesting bass tone. It almost sounds MIDI. Wow, that was some wild. This is a very rich section. Harmonically. Nice evolution into this, retaining the elements below it, but expanding. This section in particular sounds really simple compared to what comes before it. It's a unique style of contrast we don't hear too often. Gradual speeding up of the drum pattern. Certainly going on quite a bit here. Very fun idea. Okay, so chapters 1 and 2 moved into each other. 3 is isolated between 2 interludes, and then 5 and 4 and 5 go into each other. I'm going to assume. Alright, so as I mentioned, I have no idea. I vaguely remember... Might not have even been Haggard, though. It might have just been another H. We checked out a video a long time ago. It might have been last year. I don't know. Time stretched out. Everything feels relatively close to what I've done and also very far away. Time-wise, everything feels like it was so far in the past and also yesterday. But we checked out... Oh, no, that was Boris. Yeah, so definitely... I don't think I've heard any Haggard. This is wild, though. So, inspirations. We got folk, we got classical, we got metal. All 3 of them show up in a multitude of ways. We have harmonic ideas that come from all 3 of them. We have melodic ideas that come from all 3 of them. We have layering, or I guess to put another way would just be the way the instruments interact with each other. We have ideas that stem from all 3 styles. And then just general timbre, the instrumentation of the different styles. And I think it's really interesting how those 4 components of these 3 genres are played around with in a variety of different ways in order to allow so many different sections just within 11 minutes of music. There's a multitude of ideas going on in here, and no 2 sections, despite having so many similarities between them, have sounded really identical yet. Granted, that's probably going to end. There's still a finite combinations of those ideas, and there's probably going to be ones that the band tends to lean back into more often than other combinations of those various factors. And we'll end up hearing them a lot more across the rest of the album, but in just this opening two tracks, we've listened to a ton of combinations of sounds. And it is because it's not just, when it comes to symphonic metal, sometimes we just get the timbre of the symphonic side. We'll get a string section along with the music, along with the metal side, but compositionally, harmonically, melodically, it's all still very metal. The symphonic element is in sound. It's in the bringing these string instruments into the mix, more so than anything else. But no, this group is like, no, we have these three styles. We're going to use every component of them. And I find this to be fascinating, primarily because of how well everything still fits together. The goal of all three of these sounds of music, traditionally in their composition, how they all end up sounding, although there are some crossover timbre-wise between classical and folk in some elements, but still the general sound of it is very different. The composition of them is different. The goal of the execution of the music is different in all three cases, and yet it still comes together to create something fairly congruent. This just fascinates me that they can jump between all three of these different styles in so many different facets of them and still create something that feels unified to an extent. I do feel like a lot of this song, and I'm just going to say this song because both of these feel like it feels like two movements of a single idea. There really isn't a hard stop between the two tracks, and it just felt like one really long song for me. Many of the ideas do generally fit together in that there isn't any one section that sticks out amongst the others. Regardless of what combination of sounds we have going on, it generally feels like it should be a part of the rest of the song. But as far as structure goes, and pacing and transition, this is a wild track, or a wild song. There are a ton of harsh transitions throughout here, which this is 90s metal. Yeah, I mean, harsh transitions in metal is a thing. It's always going to be a thing. I know I bring it up often, but especially here, I think it is harming my ability to engage with the music. Some of these transitions are just completely out of left field. It's not like when we have regular metal and we have two guitars, bass, drum, and a harsh vocalist. So, just very stereotypical stuff. Shifting from one idea to the next without a real strong connection between the two is not sonically different. There's not a timbre shift. We've just changed ideas. It's a rough transition, but it's one that really is connected on some sonic levels, if nothing else. Haggard fights against that. We will change tempo and timbre and composition style and melodic harmonic ideas all at the same time, and it almost feels like we've entered an entirely new song with absolutely zero foreshadowing to it. It is definitely a feature, not a bug. As I mentioned, metal loves their harsh transitions. They have taken the harshness of the transition to its utmost peak, changing pretty much every single component of the song as we shift from one section to the next. It has to be intentional. There's no way that you can ensure on some of these sections that every component is different. Just through happenstance, just coincidence that happened. This feels purposeful, it feels intentful. So I don't necessarily want to throw shade at it, but it is making it difficult for me to understand the songs as anything more than a series of isolated ideas. There are larger concepts at play, sure, but generally speaking, my first reaction to the first quarter of this album is there's a lot of neat ideas here. I don't know how they all fit together, though. I'm not feeling the music as anything other than a lot of neat snippets of concepts. ideas that I do feel are, for the most part, fully explored. I don't think that there's any that we left and I was like, dang, I wish we had stuck with that a little longer and see where it expanded to. Although, now that I say that, I would have liked to see some of these ideas expanded upon. But I feel like they all told what they needed to tell within the realm of that ostinato, that riff, that melody, whatever it was. Nothing feels cut short, but nothing feels connected either. And so I ended up with like 24 really neat ideas that don't tell me a story. It's just 24 neat ideas that happen to be played back to back. And from that perspective, I don't know that I'm going to have much conclusion about theme or narrative or anything like that from a musical component. Maybe the lyrics will piece together a story for me. Maybe it's not even a concept album, although 5/8 of the album are all connected through titles, so I'm going to assume there's some sort of concept explored there. But yeah, musically, it's all over the place. And yeah, I don't know if I want to, again, throw any shade at them. 97, I'm trying to think if there was anything like this. Folk metal to me is something I just discovered this decade. I have zero history or context for Haggard. Even symphonic metal, which this does carry some elements of. I'm thinking of, Nightwish and Epica and After Forever, and I have the idea of the 2000s at least. When I first discovered After Forever's Invisible Circles was '05, '06 maybe, and I had zero context and I didn't explore any other symphonic metal for decades until y'all showed me stuff like After Forever and not After Forever, Nightwish and Epica. I always thought it was sort of a unique thing for After Forever. I'd never heard anything like it, and honestly, I didn't hear anything like it afterwards either, primarily because I didn't seek it out. But 97 feels very early. But again, I don't have the historical context for this. Um, so regardless, I do believe this would still be an early-ish point of combining metal and classical writing. I'm sure there was some of it prior. Metal had been around for a long time, a couple decades at least. I find it very weird, very hard to believe that nobody had decided, hey, maybe we should play some strings with this. Um, in all of those years. I don't think Haggard was the first, but I do find it interesting just how early this album is. It does feel before its time, and if anybody wants to give me some context on that, please throw it in the comments. I am very interested in knowing where this fits into the larger idea of things, because if it is a bit on the experimental side, which I really have no qualms about saying, I do believe, even if this isn't the inception point of any of this folk metal or classical metal, it's certainly going to be on the experimental side, as I doubt very many bands were doing it or had been doing it at this point. The experimental side allows me, in a strange sense, to be a bit more lenient on them. They didn't have a blueprint, or probably didn't have a blueprint to follow with some of this stuff. And so there is the process of experimentation, which by definition is going to be hit and miss. You're playing around with new things. You don't know what's going to work. And like I said, I am a bit more lenient on stuff like that, at least from a retrospective element. Am I going to listen to this album again? If the other 75% of this album is anything like this opening too, probably not. I'm really going to enjoy my time with it and experiencing this little bit of history, but it is a very scattered experience so far, and I'm not a huge fan of that. But I do appreciate it a little bit more, given that I don't think they had a lot of The idea is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Other people's failures allow us to excel quicker, to get past those hurdles because we're building off of experience. But when you're experimenting, when you're doing something no one else has done, yeah, part of it, the metal side, certainly on the shoulders of giants. There's lots of information at this point in time on how to make good metal music. But how to combine metal music with folk? No, you got a foundation for some of your ideas, but the rest is going to be experimenting, seeing what works. And not everything is going to work on the first time. It's just the nature of being one of the first ones there. So, appreciate from arm's length is where I think I'm going to sit with this album. Part of this that I find interesting is actually an inversion of how this genre tends to be today. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of symphonic metal tends to be metal with strings there. The strings tend to be written like metal instruments. They are given parts that a guitar could have played, but they add this timbre of a violin or a cello to the mix, or an entire string section. And it elevates. We have that really nice timbre layering. It is very cool. Um, but it also, there's this one direction. It's still metal music at the end of the day. This is sort of the inversion of that. There is metal here, but the metal compositionally is always downplayed. There really aren't any memorable riffs in here for the guitars. The bass isn't really doing anything of interest, I would say. They're all foundational. It's a lot of harmonic stuff. The guitars come in and it's a lot of chords. Sometimes those chords are moving. It isn't just hold a chord out for entire bar and then the next bar change chords or something like that. There might be a rhythmic idea to it. There might be a little movement also. Play a half note on this chord and then two quarter notes. And so there is a bit more of a melodic writing to it, but it is still at the end of the day a series of chords. It's still primarily harmonic information. It's foundational. The guitars never really get past that point. If there's a melody that needs to be played, it's given to strings, it's given to woodwind, it's given to vocals. In a very interesting sense, it is symphonic metal where the symphonic music is the key element and the guitars are a texture to it. And I find that fascinating that it's this inversion of how symphonic metal is today for a lot of bands. Speaking of the guitars, the bass, just what's going on with that bass? It's 97. So I don't know. I can hear it. That's a pretty big point. There's a lot of bands around this time who are just completely disguising and hiding the bass inside the mix. So I can hear it, but it also sounds straight up like MIDI. And I don't know what's going on with that. But it also ties into a larger idea of production on this track that doesn't quite work for me. It's very thin, exceptionally thin, even in the parts where it's supposed to be loud. It never quite feels big enough. The volume's there, but the sound of the instruments isn't. I find this most noticeable anytime the guitars are in, and even the drums. They just lack body, width, size, presence. They're so small despite the distortion, which I've talked in the past about the perception of sounds and how we have expectations tied to that. When we hear a distorted guitar, that's sonic clipping, that's audio deterioration and destruction. We expect that because it comes from the signal being too loud for the amplifier. We expect a lot of volume. When we get distortion and it doesn't have high volume, there's a disconnect there. And sometimes we can't verbalize that. We just know that it doesn't sound good. But that's usually what it is. And it's why metal tends to sound good when it's loud. It's why we always want to turn the volume up just a little bit more, a little bit more. Your ears acclimate to the new volume. You want to turn it up just one more click. Because the distortion means that it should sound loud. And that's not something that works across the board all the time, but it's a pretty common thing for humans. It's like listening to somebody scream, but then the volume's been brought down. It just doesn't sound right. You can't produce that sound, that distortion from the vocal cords without the volume. So, yeah, the production's just it's odd. And then like the growl is super loud for some reason. It's very prominent. Everything just seems to be mixed in an interesting way. I think that's the end result. Everything's rather clear. I don't have a problem with the clarity of the production. The mixing and volume levels are just a little odd for me, which I'm willing to give a little bit of leeway. It is a bit older. 97 was a different time. I don't know what kind of funding they had for this, so it could be that they couldn't hire a really good producer or something. I don't know everything that went into it. Maybe this was all intentional also. When it comes to art, there's always caveats, and unless you do an interview with somebody, you don't know what was compromises they made and what was by design. You just get the end result. If you notice the oddities or the eccentricities, you just have to guess. Did they mean to do that, or did they have to do that? And so I don't want to make any assumptions about what led to the production here, but it's just very obtuse. It's odd. The things I expect to be loud aren't. The things that I expect to be quiet aren't. I will say, though, that at least in the beginning of chapter 1, everything kind of worked, but we were all acoustic, and I think the production shines best in those moments. When we have the clean vocals, whether that's the male or the female, when we have the acoustic instruments, everything tends to work here. It really is only when we bring in the metal aspects that things just don't line up sonically. Time signature, pacing, structure. Time is interesting here. And this all kind of comes together a little bit with the harsh transitions. I wish I had thought about this section. It would have been a really nice segue. Although most of my sections have been nice segues. This feels like the first rough jump to a new idea. But it is a callback to something else we talked about. So I'm putting my improv skills to use here and trying to keep things congruent in some way along this analysis. We consistently move around between 3/4 and 4/4, which makes a lot of sense. Those 4/4 is the most common time signature in modern music. 3/4 pops up a lot in folk music, especially the type of medieval folk music that we have here, very European style folk. And so the two time signatures make sense given the type of music that we have. I'm not expecting really anything else out of it. I'm actually kind of surprised to hear the 3/4, but it is a nice change. This time signature shift between these two is often accompanied by, and sometimes embellished by, and sometimes just utilized in place of. So instead of switching from 3/4 to 4/4, we'll stay in 3/4, but we will change the tempo. There are a ton of tempo shifts in here. It is one way of keeping the pacing of the song interesting, keeping things going in some direction, keeping that momentum. We have the time signature changes, we have tempo changes. Sometimes it gets slower, sometimes it gets faster. A lot of the times it's immediate. It's what creates this sharp juxtaposition between two ideas, the rough transitions. But also we have retardandos and accelerandos, which are gradual increases or decreases of tempo over time. In some of these songs, it is just constantly shifting in a way that reminds me of the way that some progressive metal bands tend to play around with tempo, especially on earlier albums, where it's sort of kind of, I mean, like I said, it goes with the rough transition stuff. It's just haphazardly. I don't know what word I was trying to find. Haphazardly thrown in. You write a riff, And you're like, man, that's good. And then a little bit later, you write another riff. It's a little slower. I'll just toss it in there. We'll just put it back to back with the one we wrote earlier. Do we need to get there smoothly? No, not necessarily. Let's just do it. And it is one of those components that makes things rather tough to follow along with on the album. And it is possible, again, that familiarity will increase the enjoyment of the album, as these rough transitions aren't these jarring last minute turns, but become something that's predictable that you know is coming up. That's certainly going to help with it. On a first time listen, though, I feel like I'm just constantly being tossed random track on a race. And I think I'm going forward, and then there's just a hairpin turn out of nowhere, and I got to take this as I see it. I have no forward knowledge about it, and it just feels like I'm constantly being whipped around this this wild track that I have no information about. And yeah, the time signature, the tempo shifts, all of that comes into it, and the speed that we have these transitions to. Most of the sections in this track last no, I mean, these tracks, the two songs we listened to, last no more than 30 to 40 seconds. There's very few sections that we stay in for a long period of time. It creates a song that feels very fast paced, just new ideas constantly coming around every corner. And again, when you mix that with the way that things are transitioned, it feels like being in a whirlwind. It is just whiplash left and right. But there are some cool things in here too. I feel like I've just kind of rambled on about things I'm not really enjoying. The composition is very solid, though. Aside from the harsh transitions, when we look at individual sections, they are gorgeous. I think I used gorgeous, pretty, beautiful. There's positive descriptors multiple times throughout this 11 minutes. The counterpoint in here, the melody writing, the harmonic evolution, going through these chord progressions and then feeling these minor shifts in the middle of them. We'll have the same two first chords, and then the third chord will introduce maybe an uplift and bring some brightness we didn't have, or turn it into a minor and introduce some darkness here before resolving to the same place, creating this small little movement. But even after a couple repetitions, we may go to a new chord progression entirely that is unique. It's not just the same, four power chords, or not the same four power chords, but the same progression of four power chords that we hear in a lot of metal music. There is actual classical composition going on in here, and it's not just on the harmonic side either. I mentioned counterpoint, and there is so much of that in here. Just listen to any of the numerous amounts of times that there are multiple melodic elements. Sometimes they do line up and we get this really cool texture layering. There is a little bit of call and response. It's not something that we get too often in here, but if you keep your ear out for it, you will hear it a couple of times. But there's a lot of places where you just have two ideas doing their own thing, sometimes lining up. They'll just kind of being in their own world, and then they'll line up on the same melody, probably harmonizing a couple of times, and then go back into their own worlds. And it's just beautiful to listen to how these ideas intertwine and bounce off of each other and exist simultaneously. It is absolutely gorgeous. And it isn't just through the instrumentation either. The vocals aren't seen as this instrument to be placed above the band of any more import than the instruments themselves. They are often just as intertwined in this counterpoint with the flutes, with the violins, with the violas, with the guitars, with the cello. It is so cool. There's also a lot of dynamic work in here, a lot of contrast. I already mentioned on the tempo side of things, the way that the time feel is manipulated, but we have these highs, and it's not just the metal sections, the really big moments, but also, emotional highs. This rising tension or rising elation that we get sometimes through the chord progressions. We have these quieter moments, more solemn moments, more introspective moments. The song is just a roller coaster, constantly rising and falling, creating these shifting sections. It is very well written from that perspective. My really really the only complaint I have is the interconnectivity of many of these ideas. I think probably on a future album, if they continued along with this type of writing, we would have heard a maturity of structure that would have really allowed them to create some masterpieces in this realm of symphonic metal, because they really have everything else in place, except that these songs are just a bunch of ideas smashed together that don't really have a lot of things connecting them. Um, yeah, their pacing, their structure, um, and the structure, I mean like the highs and lows, right? The way that the songs are set out, not necessarily how they move between ideas or the connectivity between ideas, but the general flow of each of the songs. Um, the melody writing, the harmony, the atmospheres, everything is just so well done. And that's why I think I hammered home just a little bit more on the transitions than I normally would have, which is a bit of a passing thing. Oh, they have harsh transitions. I didn't like them. I wish they were smoother. Moving on. That's how it usually works in these. And I stuck on it a little bit longer. And I think it's because it is that one key element that if they had gotten it, this would just be perfect. Like, easily, this would immediately go into my Spotify library. I'd listen to it probably another time this upcoming week after I finish listening to some of the new releases, simply because I just really would have clicked with every bit of it. But it's this one part, and it's such a major element because it happens so often. And it feels like they were just shy of greatness, which makes sense too. If this is an early attempt at doing something like this, you're not going to hit perfection on your first time. Look at many of the best progressive metal bands and go back to their first album. It's going to be really, really rough. Ambitious, yeah. Lots of the right pieces in the right places, but not perfect. And that's how I feel about this one. It's so close to greatness, and it fell just a hair bit short. Let me hit some lyrics on these two, and we'll keep this video rolling. Alright, couple of interesting things here. Haggard was originally a death metal band, at least on their first demo disc. They had two more demo discs after this, however the second one was called Progressive and went towards a more progressive metal movement right from there. And their fourth album, with their first three being demos, is Thou Shalt Trust the Seer. This one, it's their debut LP. It's the first thing that was actually released, presumably to the public. I'm going to assume the demo discs were given to record labels in hopes of getting signed on. So yeah, when I say that this is experimental, with not a lot of blueprint to go on, and shows a strong grasp of what they wanted to do, but lacking the maturity to pull it all together, a debut album makes a lot of sense. I even compared this to a lot of progressive metal bands' debut albums. I was kind of expecting something a little bit later. This, I think, is a very strong debut, but it does show a lack of, not necessarily vision, but execution that comes with being the first thing you make. Interestingly, it's all made by one person, Aziz Nasari. He does hire people to, well, I guess hire. The band changes every album. He writes all the music, though. He composes everything. He just gets people to play with them. Says that it makes unique tour concerts simply because the lineup changes with every tour. I wonder if they play their older works alongside that. What else did I find that was interesting? There's a lot of members in this group. We have the expected vocals and guitar, bassist, second guitarist, and drummer. But we also have soprano and tenor vocals. We have violin, double bass, two violas. Oh wait, these are current members. I thought I was still on the page for the... Okay, so we still have the expected metal stuff, right? But then we also have acoustic guitars, two soprano vocalists, a bass vocalist, keyboardist and pianist, harp, violin, viola, cello, flute, clarinet, oboe, and crumhorn. I heard the oboe in track number 2, And I also forgot to mention the organ and the choir that we had at the end. I thought that was a very cool addition to it, and a way to alter the sonic landscape of that track and help it differentiate a bit from the first. Unfortunately, I do think we've heard every instrument, so unless the keyboardist has some more patches up their sleeve, I think what we've heard so far is what we're going to get for the rest of the album as far as timbre and sounds. But there is a lot of people here, and I am a big fan of that. I think it's very cool that this wasn't done with MIDI instrumentation, which we've listened to a couple of, I think primarily in the goth metal realm, where we have the MIDI strings on some of these older 90s albums. Those are very recognizable to me. 90s MIDI strings are just, they have a very distinct timbre to them. Um, in a way that I think could probably come back as some sort of retro revival and probably do very well these days, but to me immediately makes something feel dated. And instead hires on this large group of musicians to play and perform and record. I think that's really awesome, and it sounds like they tour together too, which is one of the things I mentioned way back on my very first Nightwish video, was that all of the orchestral stuff was done through backing track, and I wish they had toured with an orchestra. And everybody in the comments came to tell me, oh, the logistics of that's insane. It's Nightwish though, right? But anyways, Haggard right here is touring with the every instrument and every musician that they need. I just find that fascinating. I love it, every bit of it. And I understand not everyone can do it. There is a lot of stuff that goes into touring with this many people. But I really appreciate that this group goes out of their way to do that. Lyrics. This is interesting. This first track, The Day Is Heaven Wept, is about presumably maybe the Spanish Inquisition. It's just the Inquisition in general. It's about the church torturing and murdering people. Yeah, there's no more to it. It's about the church murdering and torturing people. And the interesting thing is, I really love this line. It says that too many brothers and sisters have died, left with no life inside to be awakened. They will never see the morning sun again. Hypocrisy killed the forsaken, who thought faith would be their only friend. They believed in the church. They believed in God, and the church is who killed them. That hypocrisy right there. Just such a good element to put in here. A really good observation of what happened here and the way that the church failed these people. It goes on and describes more of this. It talks about burning. There's smoke rising. I don't know if this is supposed to speak about burning down houses, or if this is like burning people at a stake or something like that. But it ends shifting up to God, up in heaven, watching down and weeping, saying, "This my son was crucified for. I gave up my son. I allowed him to be murdered on a cross thousands of years ago so y'all could utilize my name to torture people who believed in me." He's just like, he weeps at this. He says that I sit on my throne devoid of hope. The angels around me put down their trumpets and cry as well. Heaven weeps. Just, yeah. I actually really like this. It's a cool twist on the idea. Um, because a lot of the times that we see anti-religion lyrics, especially in metal music, it tends to condemn both the religion and the god. And I think, especially from an atheistic view, for good reason, condemning the deity as well, due to inaction. But I like this idea of the deity just being so stricken with sorrow about how his followers are using his name and what acts they're using it to commit. and just sort of being done with it all. I wash my hands clean of these humans. I'm just gonna sit here, grieve for a moment, and I'm moving on with life. I'm gonna go find something else to focus on. I need a new hobby. Apparently, creating things has failed too many times. uh, could you imagine the first humans you create immediately go against your wishes, and you throw a temper tantrum about it? You throw them out of the Garden of Eden, and then they spawn people who are so bad. You're like, nope. You flood the world. You just wipe them all out. And you're like, we should start again. And then things get worse. There's got to be a point where you're just like, nah, none of this is my fault anymore. Free will is what did this. These humans, this isn't reflective of me anymore. I'm gonna go learn basket weaving or something. I'm gonna go do something productive with my time. Oh man. Chapter 2, Origin of a Crystal Soul, is a what? I probably should have put that what after I described what it was, because I'm obviously confused, but you have no context for that. This is a song about the birth of Nostradamus, otherwise known as Michael de Nostradam. He is most known for his book, The Prophecies, in which he has presumably predicted a bunch of stuff that has happened long after his life. He is, in some sense, a seer, an oracle, being able to see the future and notating it down. That's really all this is about. It talks about some people who are too poor for warmth. They sit under naked trees in winter. All the leaves have fallen down. And then it says, like, that's how it opens. Is that there's people living under trees, and the trees aren't providing any protection from nature. And then it says it's December 14th, 1503. As the ones above stopped their mourning, as the ones arrived, selected to foresee something changed without a warning. From there, it shifts from English to German, and it says a boy was born in the time of the Christian God, so the legend goes, with the Creator's ability to see what will be. He is the mirror of your soul, feels the sadness and grief. He's the bearer of the name Michael de Notre Dame. What? How did we go from people are burned in the name of God and tortured, and God was like so distraught over that, to, yeah, there's this guy who was born, hundreds of years ago, and he's pretty good at predicting some stuff. That's the song. And like, I'm trying to pair this to the music. At least with the first track, there is, I think, a juxtaposition between the beauty of the classical and medieval writing that goes along and sort of subverts and moves against the atrocities that are being depicted through the lyrics of the Inquisition torturing people. And I think it's supposed to be, the difference there. If this is supposed to be a holy thing, listen to how beautiful this music is, but it's also this really negative thing done in the name of religion. And then we get to this song, and like, I don't even really understand what the opening stanza has to do with the birth of this dude, and the music doesn't line up with much of that at all. I do think it's interesting we shift to the organ right at the same time we shift to German. I don't know what's up with that. This is a German band, and I think it would have been less odd if everything had been in German, but the fact that this is the only German stanza after several stanzas of English in both of these tracks, it makes it stand out, and I don't know the reason for the shift. So, just kind of taken aback here. We start off the album pretty intense, and we just kind of lighten up for some reason. I'm curious where this goes. With that said, we do have an interlude next. It is an instrumental. It is only 2 minutes long. That'll take us into chapter 3 of our story. chapters 1 and 2 weren't really connected, so again, I'm not really sure what's going up with that. Combined, this is going to be about 11.5 minutes. So another lengthy section. It looks like most of these, we're going to do them in 2-song chunks, and they'll be about 10 minutes each. So let's dive into this. We're looking at Requiem in D minor, and of course a Requiem is a song of mourning or a song for the dead or something along those lines. It's usually a sad song about loss. It's really interesting, the clash here. The strings are absolutely telling me something a bit heavier. Okay, here we go. But the flute at the beginning felt a bit still of like the bouncier folk stuff. It was an interesting combination of emotions. So the primary songwriter for Haggard, does he have any traditional formal education in classical music or folk or just composition in general? Jeez. Not one of the greatest classical tracks of all time, but yeah, dude can still hold his own. And this was the beginning. I'm really curious to see how these skills have refined over the years. Because that was actually really gorgeous. I say that like I'm surprised. Tracks 1 and 2 had gorgeous sections too. Let's go. Nice idea, taking the lead melody from that dual melody line and giving it to the violin here. Random triplet feel? Hey! Oh, it goes on there. It's 3/4 for a majority of it, but there's extensions at the end of each phrase. Did they have the same lines there? She ended with do not and he picked up with do not? If so, very clever. So far, there's a lot less folk on this track, focusing more on the classical side. Still though, the textural, rhythmic guitar work. I wonder if this is one of those styles where it's more important to understand where the words are positioned against what kind of music, and maybe that would explain why the music shifts so rapidly. That metric modulation on the piano was slick. Also, does who sing the words mean much? Looking at the lyrics as poetry, just with the words, it all seems to fit together, but there could be purpose to changing vocalists for specific lines. Creating a bit of a rhythmic motif. I'd love to hear it come back, but I'm not expecting it. I don't know if someone was rushing or if it was just a disparate rhythmic ideas. The octave shift on our right flute I thought was really nice, playing the same line an octave higher when the other flute came in. Nice transition there from his clean to his growl. And see, raised intensity for one beat, bring it back down just to bring it back up. It feels just slapdashedly thrown together. It disrupts the flow and doesn't seem to add any information due to it. It is as far as I can tell, experimentation for experimentation's sake. Which works well in some contexts, but I just don't think it works too well in this one, given how, especially this song, how good everything is together.
Als am Pfahl sie brennt, nun schwarz ist die rote Sau, niemand mehr
It's an interesting growl too. It's layered. It sounded more monstrous than anything else. I thought I was really gonna like that. The high intensity back down, and where it went just so unintuitive. Yeah, a bit cliche of an ending, but it works so well that I can't even really be mad at it. Alright, I think that's going to be the word that I think sums up all of my feelings regarding the shifting of ideas in this album is just unintuitive. Because I think that that is a nice subjective element and a bit vague as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that the way that we move between ideas is wrong or bad or unenjoyable. There's probably quite a few people who really like this album, and maybe the harsh transitions and constant temporal fluxes are a part of why they love it. But UnIntuitive does describe the connectivity of it. It just doesn't really ever make sense to move from one idea to the next. And that's less of a... Actually, I think I mentioned this as a subject. This is an objective description of it. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It just means that it makes little sense within traditional theory. And, you know, I definitely have my biases for a bit more of a traditional writing. And yeah, I think that's going to be the end. I don't think I want to bring this topic back up again, simply because I've pretty much exhausted it on the last analysis. But I said that word just a little bit ago, and I was like, yeah, that's it. It's just unintuitive. It doesn't make any sense to me. What I know about music would never have me naturally moving from some of these ideas to the ones after them. And I think that this song does kind of reach a peak there with those constant back and forths of loud metal and soft acoustic sections, and shifting between them with just a beat or two apart, this constant back and forth between them as a sort of, I don't know, like a confusing transition. It's not even just a harsh transition. It's one where as we are in it, I have no idea where we're going. We were loud, now we're quiet, then we're loud again. When is this going to stop? How is it going to stop? What are we going to land on? It gives me more questions than usual, where on a typical harsh transition, it's just, where are we now? Here, I don't even know when now is going to be now, because it could be then, because we're still in the transition. And it just turns it into a very confusing part of the song. And it happened like 3 times on this track, which makes me think that the composer really enjoyed that twist. I think it's kind of neat. Maybe it makes more sense again on subsequent listens, but I did not find it was good enough to repeat once, much less twice. And I did find that I was growing a bit tired of that idea. But you know, that's just human nature. We all have things that we like. We don't have to like everything. And again, I think I just lean into it a little bit because everything else is so freaking good. Like, it's this one part and it's just too big of a hurdle for me to say I'll deal with it. And I think that's what kind of upsets me the most about it. Because it takes us to the next idea of a hurdle. I don't know why I said because to lead us into this. I think I had a nice segue and I didn't. Anyways, this is also a hurdle though that I find coming into this. There's a part of this album so far, being halfway through it, that always tends to disrupt my enjoyment. Not quite as much as the harsh transitions or the wild when are we gonna stop high and low switching. This is another song I need to make a shirt. Hashtag ruined by metal. That's not to say every time the metal section comes in, I find that I dislike the music. As I mentioned, a lot of the times the guitars, they come in and it's just texture. It's just rhythm. Very rarely do the guitars or bass add really much to the musicality. They tend to add atmosphere more than anything else. The drums create a nice backbeat because we really don't have a lot of percussion in the acoustic. Well, I mean, the drum kit's acoustic too, but we don't really have a lot of percussion in the classical side of things. There's a little bit, we do get percussive elements out of some of the rhythmic sections from the strings and the woodwinds, but we really don't have a strong percussion section present. So the drums are a bit of a contrast. We sort of need them. But frequently also, I found in this track, they tended to be a bit more metronomic than in the first two tracks, where I found them to be a bit more melodic. I find that to be a really interesting shift in composition. Regardless, there are many times that the metal comes in and we replace beautiful melody writing for growls. And I find every time this happens, I'm a bit disappointed. I like when the growls are accompanied by something else. Maybe a flute, maybe one of the soprano vocalists. Something to go along with it and provide something melodic. Because we do enter some sections that are pure metal. We get the bass and guitars giving us foundational rhythmic texture things. The drums give us the rhythm, and the backbeat and the groove. And then we have the growls on top of it. If we're lucky, we have a flute or a violin or a vocalist providing something melodic, but there are a couple of sections that are just the metal band, and one, they sound very small without all of the extra orchestration around it. I mentioned in the production section of the last analysis portion, the metal band's just not really given a lot of prominence in the mix, so it sounds a bit flat when they come in, but they just don't have anything melodic representative in them. And when we exclude most of the other instruments, we also exclude a melodic role. And so I find those segments to be a bit dull. Even if I do appreciate the contrast, I don't like what the contrast brought. I think we can still have melodic sections in there while still focusing on the timbre of this, distorted sound. Whether that be the distortion, the natural distortion of the vocals, or the electronic distortion of the guitars. It's a contrast. I like the contrast. It just doesn't do something that I enjoy enough to say, yeah, I enjoy having this contrast more than I enjoy not having it. And I think in this case, I'd rather not have that contrast if it means more of this amazing melody writing, this multi-layered melodic writing. So yeah, I mean, it's not something that happens all the time, but there were a couple sections in that song in particular when we kind of shift to a more metal focused section. I'm like, God dang, that just ruined my enjoyment. The metal came in and ruined things. So, I mean, it's still a bit of a joke, right? The word of ruined, I think, is very hyperbolic. It's not like it's completely devastated the song, but I just really like that phrase, and I don't remember the first time I used it, but it's like, it sits in my head. Anytime I find something really beautiful, and then we simplify it way down for something metallic, especially if it's growls, because they just still haven't grown on me. It's just the phrase that pops in my head. Dang, the metal just ruined my enjoyment. Um, Speaking of the multi-layered melody, we had so much more of it here. This is probably easily my favorite song so far. I did like Requiem in D minor. I thought that was very beautiful and very cohesive. A 2-minute song will do that for you. You don't have a lot of time to mess around with ideas, and if nothing else, it felt like the composer was very focused on what that song was aiming to do. It started off a bit odd with the flute being a bit bouncier and folkier, but it only took 20 seconds or so for everything to get in line and fit within that solemn Requiem style of writing. So, yeah, I think as far as a perfect piece of focused execution, everything being in line with a single idea, Requiem in D minor certainly fits that as the best so far. But A Pale Moon Shadow, I think, has the best writing that is actually still consistent despite all of the shifts that we have throughout it. I mean, some of these sections, man, we must have 3 or 4 melodic related lines, usually 2 or 3 points of counterpoint. So we have 2 or 3 melodies going on, doing their own things, bouncing around each other. We have this cool call and response that's built into some of the melodies, where one will be like da 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 da, and while it holds out that last note, the other one is going to go da 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 da, and when it lands on its note, this one starts playing again, playing notes rather than holding one. And it's this back and forth where they're both carrying their own melody, but it creates a sense of call and response because one plays around the other's rests. And then while some of this stuff is going on, there is also a third instrument kind of doing its own thing. And then sometimes a fourth instrument that is doing something that toes the line between ornamental and melodic, where it is primarily ornamental. It's packs of ideas, but they play so frequently. It isn't like a little twinkle over here and then taking a couple of bars off. You play your 4 notes, and then you take a couple beats off. Then you play 3 more notes. You take maybe a bar off. And so it is ornamental, but it's ornamental with less space between each of the ornaments. It's more clustered, like the difference between a Christmas tree with 5 ornaments and a Christmas tree with 100. And that's a weird metaphor. I hope that gets the point across. There's more glittery things happening in this song. And just trying to find how all of it works together. This song in particular is one I'm going to revisit on my own sometime. Uh, I really wanted to say like today after the video or something, but I got to do the thumbnails. These videos tend to have like 60 or 70 timestamps. That takes quite a bit of time. And then I'm kind of wiped out. I don't really want to listen to music anymore, especially since I've just thought about music. I've had the brain engaged for like 4 hours. Um, but I do want to come back to it. Because I think there's a lot of stuff I missed on this first listen just due to the sheer complexity and depth of the melodic sections. And that's even completely ignoring what happens under it. I could not tell you what the bass or cello or maybe some background vocals or the drums or the guitar were doing at this part. I really couldn't. There were so many melodic ideas going off. That was all I could focus on. And by the time I you know, got a little bit of an understanding of it. It was like, maybe I can find some time to squeeze into something else. We had moved on to a new idea entirely. But yeah, like, it's so good. And it pops up so often in here. I think tracks 1 and 2, we primarily saw one section of counterpoint. So a melody and a counter melody. But having the 3-way and kind of 4-way, if you want to qualify it that way, on this one is just, it's just wow, man. And it all works. There's so many layers. And it's not just about knowing what chords are going on. You have to know what notes are going on for so many instruments. This is a typical thing when you write classical music, especially more involved classical music like Renaissance and Baroque. And he just executes it so masterfully. I want to dig into it. So I want to get some sheet music for In a Pale Moon's Shadow. I just really want to understand what's going on in it because it's so good. And I talked about during Requiem in D minor that this is really good classical writing. Not best of the best. He deserves to be, have his name up with some of the best contemporary classical composers of the last century or whatever. I don't know. Maybe he does. I haven't heard any of his newer works. I'm still hearing the beginning of his career here. But even right here, I hear a ton of potential, and it's still very well executed. Uh, it's iterative, right? I'm just going to throw that out there. I don't say that with any shame or disgust. You listen to my classical music, it's iterative as well. I'm not out here making new forms of classical. I'm very much copying a lot of my inspirations within the realm, and I hear a lot of that here too. Nothing I've heard in these 4 tracks is blowing my mind, but it's just so well done. It's executed on such a level that I think, it's good. It reminds me of checking out Casey Crescenzo. Is that his last name? The dude from The Deer Hunter. He released a classical album recently. Was that the Romantic? I think it was. I think he modeled his music after the Romantic era of classical. We checked out a track from it though. Very iterative. Definitely wearing his inspirations on his sleeve, not doing anything new within the realm, but doing what he's doing at a very high level. And that's what I feel here as well. I think the big difference though is, again, it's the consistency. These ideas don't really flow into each other, so I think that his individual ideas are just absolutely fantastic. I just really want that last hurdle to start connecting the concepts together in meaningful ways. So I did want to throw that out there. And I think that's why, again, it's not so much that I think the metal parts are bad. They're just not at the same level as the classical parts. And they could be. It's about that last step. There's so much freaking potential on the first half of this album, and I'm kind of mad because he's so close to crossing the finish line, and it's like, I don't know, it's like he got injured and fell over, like 99.9% done. Like the ribbon is right there, just flick it and you'll be done. And no, I just didn't cross it. And I find that to be a little frustrating because it really feels like he could have. But again, I really hope that maybe on a future album, this compositional maturity occurs after getting some experience under his belt of writing like this, and he combines a lot of the really great writing here with an evolution of structure. So I know I've been harsh, maybe critical for sure of this album, but it does come from a place of wanting him to grow as a composer, because I really think he's destined for some really great stuff. Um, And again, it might be completely out of place. He may have evolved fantastically since this. It is retroactively speaking here. I think that this criticism might be more well placed if I was alive in 97 and old enough, I suppose I was alive in 97, to have heard this and given him notes in some capacity. Because, again, he may have evolved past this. I'm going to look up some lyrics to this 4th track, and then we are going to keep going forward. All right. This song, I believe, continues on about Nostradamus. It speaks about a child screaming deep in the night, having dreams, scary dreams, horrifying dreams. A parent comes in, "Do not fear, my son. Awake the dragon inside, for he may guide you, being the world's hidden eye." So there's a power within you that allows you to see more than other people. You have a hidden eye. It allows you to dream like this. Now, that's not the first stanza. The first stanza is an element that we repeat later on. I don't necessarily want to call it a chorus, but it is something that comes back Later, it is in Latin. It says, poorly translated because Google's Latin translation is not great. It says, repulse the eternal enemy, give peace, and immediately, as for the guide, we avoid all harm. I don't quite understand that, but again, I might not be getting the full picture. We checked out something recently that had Latin in it, and Google's translation helped me none at all. And then I found somebody who translated it by hand, and it was... The Google one was like 60% there, but missing just enough of the context for it to not really make much sense. I get the idea here. There's some sort of eternal enemy. This could be a lot of things. It could be sin, given the Christian overtones to the religious overtones to a lot of this album so far. It could be Satan. It could be doubt. It could be war. The eternal enemy could really be anything, and I think it might actually happen to be something to do with humanity and fear, based on what we're about to see in this kid's vision. But it says that we'll try to avoid all harm as we have a guide, somebody, a seer, who can tell us about the future. Interestingly, also, I noticed that despite Spotify having the album title as a solid line, and thou shalt trust the seer, what's on the album art has a ... an ellipsis after the trust. It creates a pause, and thou shalt trust the seer. That's how I read it. Anyways, kind of comes off a bit superhero-y, I suppose. But I think it also feels a bit more like a warning, a threat almost. You should trust your seer. That kind of thing. It has some animosity to it. And so is this album then about Nostradamus predicting the future on things? Because now we have two songs about Nostradamus, although the opening track wasn't. And my hypothesis that track 4 here is about Nostradamus is simply because it is about a child who can see the future, and we already saw this child being born in the previous song, so it's a tenuous connection at best, but it is one, and it follows in line with the themes of the album title, so I'm kind of thinking that's how it goes. It would not surprise me if chapters 4 and 5 also speak about a seer or somebody prophesizing the future, in which case I'm just going to connect all 5 chapters to be about Nostradamus in some way or another. So anyways, we got this kid who's a guide for the world, says that he analyzes the midnight sky, and feels a warm beating heart in his head, almost believing it might be God of some sort speaking to him. Later, it appears that he has one of these hallucinations. I don't think this is what Nostradamus really did, but maybe so. Maybe I got to read up on this dude. I did not think he was a mystic type of seer. I thought he just kind of saw patterns in the past and found notes and stuff, and then made hypotheses about the future based off of world patterns or something, off of old texts and stuff. I didn't think he had visions. Regardless, he has this vision, and it says that he feels he must be dreaming. There is fear in the accused eyes as he's watching. The accused are on a wooden coach. They're innocent, but they've been sentenced to death, and he can't not see the fear in their eyes. And he thinks he's dreaming. He looks up at the sky. Heaven it's burning as red as blood. And then it says that the sky reflects this pain, this fear that the people have, and that they're burning for their superstition. When will humans ever learn? And of course, this kind of feels like the Salem witch trials. Once again, religion killing people in the name of God. Kind of lines up a little bit with what we saw earlier. After this, the song shifts to German. Again, the album does this. So this is the third language on the album. And it just speaks about a woman being burned at the stake. It says that her red hair now becomes black, and now nobody doubts that she was obviously a witch. And so they kick her and spit on her and laugh at her, and the flames put an end to her suffering. But despite that, there is still a throb of fear in the deep black night. And that's how it ends, with the assurance that she won't be the last person burned for simply existing. How sad is that? Alright. Now I don't know how to proceed here. I had mentioned we were going to do 2 more sets of 2. However, we have Interlude, Chapter 4, 5, and then Outro. If I group them together, Chapters 4 and 5, I'm going to have a break between. But I don't think I want to. But I also don't think either the interlude or the outro are worthwhile making an analysis section for on their own, since they're both only 2.5 minutes long. I'm kind of tempted just to run the whole thing together, but that's going to put us at 20 minutes of music. Screw it. Let's play it by ear. I'm just going to hit play, and when I feel like stopping, when I feel like I'm at a good stopping point, I'm going to do that. Let's dive into this. The next one is called Cantus Firmus in A minor. It's so simple too. The cello's playing half notes, one violin's playing quarter notes, and the other one's playing a melody on top of it, and it's so good when it comes together. So a repeat of this passage. I do like this track, but it is very repetitive. There is one idea, we've repeated it 3 times, and we had a variation of it in the middle, which creates this nice A-A-B-B-A-A. Ooh! That's actually a really nice place to bring that guitar, and that's one of the times the metal, I think, elevates it. I do want to point those out a couple times because it does happen. I know I said ruined by metal earlier, but the ruining is not all the time. There is some really good instinct of when to bring the band in. time was free there. Even pulling, whether you want to call it rushing or free time accelerando, pulling that back, that energy, slowing it down for this section. Yeah. Little ornamental bits against that, the riff, the guitar riff. Give me more of that. Let the guitars in on the classical writing, please. Yeah, I love the way everything worked there. Field recording of Rain, that's... the turnarounds. Yeah, another situation with a nice use of the tempo shift. Yeah, bringing that little ostinato back on the piano from the transition. It's a nice callback there. Okay, I think we're like 3.5 minutes in now, and I haven't had a single complaint about transitions. Not only that, but I've actually brought up callbacks. It's a very raw drum production too. I don't think I've noticed that before. I like hearing the... Okay. This is a section for the guitars to show off a bit. Get away from the chords, have a walking bass line, melody. The guitars were included in the classical writing earlier, like at the 1.5 minute mark. No? Dang. So is it 3-4-3-3? I think it was 3-4-3-3. That's an interesting shifting 6-7, but putting the 7 first. I expected nothing less. Although I guess technically the right side. I expected nothing less from a guitar solo. I think it's the first guitar solo we've heard. Yeah. Just write more violin parts, give it to the guitars. Seriously, it's gonna be so good. Yeah, there are a lot of extensions though. This is not the first time I've been unable to find a time signature because there's an odd extension somewhere. Bringing this back, that's how the song started. Alright, we're gonna pause it right there simply because it was a nice clean break. I want to talk about something we haven't really touched on much, which is the use of the interludes. Tracks 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7 all have the subtitle of chapter blank. I'm going to assume that these 5 chapters are somehow all interconnected about Nostradamus, which I think I've already mentioned in the past. I was correct in stating with my earliest hypothesis that tracks 3 and 5, given that they weren't given a chapter name and were also extremely short, were going to be interludes. I'm still not sure about the final track, but I do think it's going to be another instrumental interlude, but it'll be an outro for the entire album. Where do the interludes fit in the story? Aside from chapter 1, chapters 2 and 3 have been about Nostradamus, and the album is titled That You Should Trust the Seer. Nostradamus seems to be the seer of the story. My guess is that when we dig into chapter 4's lyrics, we're going to find more information about Nostradamus, and chapter 5 will also have a bit of that. So that puts us at Requiem in D minor, track 3. Coming between chapter 2, the birth of Nostradamus, and chapter 3, a child Nostradamus terrified of his visions and dreams. What does Requiem in D minor mean to those? Should I even read it in the larger context? Should I simply just say the 5 chapters are interconnected and track 3 and 5 are interludes for the album, in that they act as a way to break up some of the more dense writing? I think that's the more accurate way to go about it. 3 and 5 both have similar elements to them in that they're classical instrumental pieces written with primarily just exclusively just the symphonic instrumentation. And are hyper focused in execution. They both have one idea and they lean into it for the entirety of their runtime, which makes sense given the shortness of their runtime, but I mean, this dude has also shown us just how many styles he can throw into just the opening 90 seconds of a song. So having one style in 2 minutes to me shows a lot of restraint, intentional restraint. I think it is designed as a palate cleanser between the main attractions of the album, which are going to be the longer, diverse 5 chapters. Because otherwise, if I try to read it within the story, Requiem in D minor certainly makes sense with some of the themes of the album. It is a somber track. It is about loss and grief, which makes sense because at least two, well, 2.5 of the sets of albums we've looked at have focused on human loss, of churches utilizing the power of religion and the superstition of religion in order to torture and kill other humans. It is horrific, and through that, the loss of life should be mourned. A requiem makes perfect sense for that. But as far as placing that between chapters 2 and 3, that doesn't really make much sense to me. Chapter 2 is the birth of a kid. Chapter 3 is the story of a kid having a dream about the Salem witch trials that'll happen hundreds of years in the future. So, it's a weird place to put it narratively, which makes me think it probably is more of a album palette cleanser. You just listen to 11 minutes of intense classical folk metal. Here, have something that's a bit more focused to chill out to for a second before we hit the 9.5 minute epic, the longest track on the album. We get to Cantus firmus, and like I said, like Requiem, it is a singular focused track, but it just, I honestly think it's the repetition that does it for me. I like how it has variation in it. As I mentioned, the structure is probably something along the lines of AABBAA, where we have the initial form of an idea, we hear it twice, we have a variation on that form, we hear it twice, and we return to the original form and hear it twice. It means that we hear the original form 4 times, and I don't think it had the staying power for that. I think I talked through a lot of the back half of that song, primarily because I was just waiting for the next track to kick in. Nothing against it. Again, the A section is solid writing. I love hearing the variation on the idea, something I haven't really heard too much of on the album. The idea is solid. The execution leaves me wanting. This is that's how I'm going to describe most of the album. There is a lot of really great ideas here. I just wish he had made them after having more experience under his belt. On the topic of variation, though, I think I use this word often, and maybe some people know what it is, and maybe some people don't. It's when you take something and you modify some elements of it and create something new from it. The variation could be 80% new, it could be 80% old, as long as you have some way to say, hey, yeah, this is based off of the original. Now, there are certainly ways that are tougher to hear. And I want to make that clear because I said that Cantus firmus had the first variation in it that I heard. Because there are variations that I can't hear too clearly. Changing a couple of notes in it, but retaining the opening half of an idea, I'm going to pick up on that real easy. Classical music has 2 types of variations, though. One is reversing it. Just take the notes and play them backwards. That one is very hard to hear. It is very rare for me to pick that one out. The other one would be inversion, which is where you take the sheet music and you flip it upside down, so all the high notes are now low notes. So that one, the rhythm is going to be the same. Unlike when you reverse it, your rhythm's going to change. But the direction also changes. Anytime that you were going to be rising in pitch, you're now lowering in pitch. Sometimes I can hear those patterns. I can match the rhythm and the inverted pitch direction, say, oh, this is an inversion of the other section. But that one's also a bit harder to hear than the types of variations I tend to pick up, which is utilized often in metal, which is stuff like changing the end of a lick or extending something. Actually, we have a lot of extensions in this album where, well, let me just bring this up real quick, because that was about all I needed to say there. I can hear some variations. I heard some in track 5. Maybe there's more variations in the album I haven't heard, since it is classically influenced, and classical music, especially the Baroque era that there's a bit of influence from in here, utilizes a lot of variation. But yeah, this other part, time, right? I talked about earlier that the album typically resides in 4/4 or 3/4. That is still true. However, the ways that these time signatures are utilized are being increasingly complex. So an extension, or I guess removal, I don't really have a term for when you do the opposite. So say you're in 3/4. You play a bar of 3/4, 1, 2, 3, another bar, 2, 3, another bar, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And the fourth bar has an extra beat to it. You extended it. Prog metal loves to do this. You can find it all over the place with Dream Theater, with Haken, Between the Buried and Me. This is a very common practice. There's also the shortening, where maybe you do 3 bars of 4 and the last one is just a bar of 2 or a bar of 3, where you have this idea, this feeling, this flow of the temporal logic of the song, and then it gets changed just for a moment in time and then resets back to the norm. They do that here, but in weird places. As I had mentioned in De la Morte Noire, which is the track we just listened to, chapter 4, there was one section that I'm like 80% confident was a bar of 3 and then 4 and then 3 and then 3, putting the extension in the middle of the phrase rather than the end of it. That is a very interesting technique. It is not something that we never see in metal. That is to say, we have seen it in prog metal before. It's just a lot more, it's more rarer than putting the extension at the end, which I think just tends to make more sense to people. And I wonder if some of the other sections where I couldn't figure out the time signature in earlier songs, even particularly Pale Moon Shadow, which I think came up a couple times, was because of this mid-phrase extension or a mid-phrase reduction. But it's what creates some of the metric oddities that we have. We also saw a lot of triplet usage in here on the drums and piano primarily, hearing this metric modulation as a sort of polyrhythmic idea against a traditional quarter note beat that we have elsewhere, creating this, at times, a hemiola in places. That was neat and not necessarily something we see a lot of in its influences, but is definitely something that shows up in metal a lot. And finally, an element that I think, while not being directly a metallic compositional idea, is something I think I could accredit more to the metal side than the folk or classical elements that fairly clearly are predominantly the influence in the composition of this album. I think that about wraps that up. This chapter, much like the other chapters, is very similar in its approach. It is a bit more focused, and I liked that. I had mentioned at like the 3.5 minute mark or 4 minute mark or something like that, that everything is relatively cohesive. We had callbacks, we had extensions of ideas, we had foreshadowing on transitions. Yeah, everything just sort of clicked for a while, and I just kind of wish we had saw more of that. And we had the guitar chiming in on some of the classical writing, and the guitar even got some melody in here, which is really great because, as I mentioned earlier, the guitars have been relegated mostly to texture to bring in that distorted feeling to a primarily classical sound overall. And so I want more of that. Again, I think as I dive into more albums, I'll start to hear some of this writing that I'm requesting pretty heavily here, but there are evidences of it, and I think that's really cool. It's not so much um, it's not so much that the album doesn't do it, it just doesn't do these types of things as often as I would have wanted. Um, when there's a lot of reasons of why that could have came about. Again, I don't want to hypothesize about it, but I'm really happy to hear some of this here, which at least, if nothing else, tells me this person can do this, and hopefully in the future they lean into it a bit more than they did here, for whatever reason they chose not to. Let's hit some lyrics for chapter 4 and keep this rolling. Alright, I'm a little lost on this one. It seems to be more premonitions. It says, born through astral constellation, those pictures are now getting clearer inside his head and sent by the highest God. They start to rise from the deepest depths. So it seems like it's no longer just these vague dreams and images, that what he's seeing in his head, these premonitions, are becoming very clear, and he feels that they're sent by God. Ooh! Is this a sort of time travel story? Just stay with me for a second, okay? So God weeps for what humanity is doing despite his son dying on the cross to absolve them of their sins. And yet they still torture and maim and kill each other, even worse, in God's name. I had the image of him washing his hands clean after this, saying, this is a failed project, I'm gonna move on to something else. But instead, what if he put a prophet down on earth and said, hey, bro, I'm gonna put some images in your head of the future. Maybe just people knowing what will happen will try to avoid them. What if that's the purpose of chapter 1? To show us a plan from this God, to try to avoid any future pain. And he puts all that pain in a single person. The visions of the future of things not yet happened, but will, in hopes that he tells people and we avoid some of this catastrophic stuff. I think I finally connected chapter 1 to everything else. So anyways, from here we have a quick little, what are they called? When he gets the old psychic storytelling from the future. A premonition. It just says, my king, dead. No. Dying by the lance, so slow. And then he comes out of it. He wipes away the tears and he tries to think, but his hope begins to sink. He fears this power, is what the next passage brings up. And then we have two stanzas that are identical in German. It says, it came to remember in man's repentance the bird's mask, nods a mocking greeting, wrapped in black, carried on a black horse to enslave humanity. The Lord of plagues came, and the plague reigns with a punishing hand, and corpses cover the land. So is this supposed to be the bubonic plague then? The bird masks are the doctor's masks that were supposed to keep them safe. Some sort of air ventilation thing. I actually don't know how they work. I just know the imagery of it. So yeah, that's what that's about. He has another premonition. It's interesting that the premonitions are in German. Not consistently, but predominantly. We snap out of that. Comes back to English. It says, out of the sorcerer's chamber? Or do they come straight from the hands of the goal? This rose's leaves seem to be magic and saved all the poor population below. I don't know what particularly this track itself is supposed to do other than showcase that his powers are growing, that the images in his mind are becoming clearer, and that they are still depressing to experience. And maybe that's all this album's supposed to be about. Maybe it's not supposed to be an overarching story. Maybe it's just a really nice frame story for speaking about the evils of humanity and the cycles of the evils of humanity, of how past, present, and future don't really change. The names of the events, the people who partake in them do, but people being cruel to each other is just a tale as old as time. Maybe that's the purpose of the album. Kind of bleak, but it's not wrong. History has certainly shown patterns. Before we get into the final set of tracks, it's only 7.5 minutes worth. In fact, it's going to be the shortest part of the this entire video. Is 7 minutes of music is the shortest group that we've had so far. I wanted to talk a little bit about fandom and popularity, because this is something that always intrigues me with stuff like this. If somebody ever asked me to break down a Taylor Swift album, it is not going to surprise me when I go on Spotify and see she has 20 bajillion listeners every month, and her plays are in the I make too much money range just from the pennies that I get from these views. But then we listen to stuff like this, and my initial reaction is this is rather small, this is rather niche, and that's usually quite accurate. Haggard isn't, though. Despite being folky, classical, symphonic metal, it's kind of popular. It's probably not running the same numbers as something like Nightwish does, but they do have almost 200,000 monthly listeners, which seems like a lot from my understanding of what this band is, listening to this album, and kind of getting the impression that they've continued to walk down this path, and given the fact that it's a growling band, and one that I've never heard. I don't think the band name Haggard has come across my vision since I've started the channel, and it's certainly not a band I knew about prior. But then I look at some of the plays, and this album is consistently listened to. There are between 5 and 800,000 plays on these songs in total. Even something like Requiem in D minor, which is a 2-minute interlude, is one of the most listened to tracks. The song we're moving into next is the most listened to at 808,000, but none of these are really a slouch other than the outro at just 200,000, a massive dip from the next lowest at 500,000. Basically, as far as I can see it, there's a couple of singles. Chapter 1 and Chapter 3 seem to be, and Chapter 5, they seem to be outliers. But other than that, everything seems to be rather listened to similarly, in a way that makes me feel like people listen to this as an album, which probably makes sense given its short runtime. It's 8 songs at 40 minutes. It's very digestible. But it's also an album that, the more I come to understand it, the more that I think it works best where each track works best by listening to what comes around it. I could certainly see listening to In a Pale Moon's Shadow by itself. I think that's a pretty good standalone track, but even track 1, I think, doesn't do as well on its own. It works best in conjunction with chapter 2, since it even directly moves into it. If you listen to just chapter 1 and quit, you're stopping in the middle of a song. Honestly, those are 2 movements of a single song, despite being broken up into 2 tracks. And I think a lot of people understand that and listen to it that way, and it's something I don't see too often. Even on... I feel like every time I look at this, there's always those songs that are super popular, and then the rest of the tracks are eh. And as the list goes down, they become less and less played. But that's just not true here. Haggard's fans are very dedicated. They put this album on and they listen to the album. Though it does seem like a lot of people skip the outro. I'm interested to see why. But yeah, the numbers are a lot higher than what I would have expected, both for the band and for this album, given what I've heard so far. And I find that to be really fascinating, but also awesome. I kind of hope that the fandom, both when they came out and the persistence of it over the years, is 100% what has given them the opportunity to continue to grow and continue to release music the way they have. And I'm very appreciative of that, especially since this whole time I've been saying this is a fantastic start, but I want to see what comes next. And I'm glad that they've been given the affordance to do that, to continue to make music. All right, here we are. The last 7 minutes. Let's dive in. See how this wraps up with Lost Robin's Song and A Midnight Gathering. I have a real bad feeling about this. Okay, here we go. I was like, it's the most popular, it's the shortest full song, this is just going to be metal. But no, we've still got, it's actually a really nice mix between all the sides so far. It's interesting too because the other 4 chapters are very linear, just always moving to the next idea. This, so far, is just verse, chorus, verse, chorus. We haven't really had a chorus at all on the album until now. And everything is built off of what came before. This is honestly just a rock ballad with some strings in it. It's a very different idea from the rest of the album. And for whatever reason, they really focused on this cohesive singular vision where everything else is very diverse, jumping around between a lot of ideas. The violin guitar here is so good. I know I was talking over some of it. I was listening to it. I'm sorry if you couldn't hear it. We got the call and response, choir, instrument. All right, let's bring it home. Timpani? What's the other drum? Oh no, those are just toms with really heavy reverb? I don't know. Someone's gonna have to let me know. The more that I hear them, the less I recognize the individual timbre of them. See, this one note does sound like a timpani though, but everything else sounds like toms, and I didn't see timpani in the personnel list, so. Okay. Interesting harmonic. I don't think we heard those chords anywhere on this album. Lots of tension, dissonance in a way that really hasn't been utilized. Maybe it's not dissonance. I mean, not. It kind of sounded out of tune, actually. Which is. We've heard the choir before. They're not. They're not slacking. So, return to this. Yeah, if anyone has information about what percussion's being utilized there, I would love to know. All right. So this is a really interesting way to end the album. A Midnight Gathering, we'll get to it in a second. Lost, Robin's song. The most played song on the album, also happens to be the most cohesive and the least classically influenced. That's not to say that it is completely devoid of classical components, it just feels a lot more at home being a rock ballad that happens to introduce some light classical ideas, more so than what the rest of the album is, which is classical music that occasionally incorporates growling and distorted guitars in metal styles. This inverts all of it. And so it is the most traditional song on the album, I think, as far as guitar, bass, drums, and vocalist goes. We have a very typical rock style of music here. No distorted guitars, I don't think. It's all acoustic, right? That's why I mentioned Ballad. We have some finger picking, I think, that's going on the left pan guitar. And it's all chordal outlining, where it sounds like a melody because the guitar is playing a series of eighth notes, but it's going up and down the scale, the chord that we're currently in, and moves as the chord moves. So it gives us the information of a chord without just playing the full chord, all the notes at the same time. we do have some melodic ideas, especially towards the bridge when we have the guitar and the violin doing some really nice counterpoint. But aside from that, it follows the verse chorus structure that we don't really get anywhere else on this album. It is predominantly focused on this guitar providing the harmonic information, the vocal on top of it, some light drum work. It's a rock song. It really is. That's the end result of it. Including using the typical structure of a rock track. It's a really interesting departure. It is the most palatable, I think, for a mainstream audience. It makes sense that is their most popular, but it really isn't by that much. Only 6,000 more plays than in A Pale Moon's Shadow, which is easily one of their most experimental and progressive tracks on the album. It's also their longest. The runtime here also helps it feel more rock than anything else. Their shortest track previously was pretty much 6 minutes long, and this one's 4.5, which feels about right for a rock track from the 90s. Everything about it feels directly aimed to be a traditional song more so than the experimental stuff they had been playing around with for this entire this entire album, which also feels interesting because it feels the most divorced from their roots. As I mentioned earlier, their first demo was a death metal band before they decided to add some progressive elements on their second demo. This being their first LP still has some death metal foundation to it in places. The guitars, the bass, the drums, the growls, but it moves so far away from that into the realm of classical and folk, really being predominant in the compositional choices, with the metal elements being flavor or spice to it. And so to pretty much wrap the album up on a traditional rock song feels interesting from both perspectives, in that it's very different from where they came from, and it's also very different from what the album is attempting to do. But then we wrap that up with a midnight gathering. Some drums trying to sound ritualistic, a choir coming in, the drums coming back with, I don't remember, some melodic instrument playing a little folky ditty on top of it, and then the drums to take us out. It feels like it's supposed to represent a type of ritual in the woods under a pale moonlight. Dancing with the devil. No. These folks have certainly danced with the devil under the pale moonlight. But it is an interlude. There are lyrics, though, which I was not expecting, but it is a type of interlude, much in the way of Cantus, Firmus, and Requiem, in which it is hyper-focused on a singular idea in a way that the album has traditionally not been throughout the runtime, and also feels quite distinct from everything else musically. It takes a lot more from a sort of Wiccan folk, whereas the folk element that informs most of the music is more of a medieval folk. I don't know, like bards. It's kind of the feeling I get. Bards telling stories to music at like festivals where knights battle to see who's the best jouster and stuff. So then we get this very, like I said, to me it feels very Wiccan. It feels very ritual. I don't know. It also introduces dissonance, which the choir has been present elsewhere in the album and hasn't really been dissonant, which makes me feel like it's a choice. To be out of tune is honestly what it felt like to me. A bunch of people just slightly around the right pitches rather than purposefully introducing dissonant harmony into it. I don't know what to make of it. I'll be curious to see what the lyrics are about, and maybe it might give some insight into the other two interludes as well. But I'm still kind of feeling like these three songs are separate. They exist outside of the 5 chapters present. With all of that said, I did like Robin's song. I mean, I said it was more palatable, more traditional, and I do like palatable music. I have a soft spot for rock. I grew up on rock music, so I got no problem with that. It is an interesting choice in the scope of the album, but I did enjoy it, and it was very cohesive. Every idea was built on the last, either using foreshadowing to introduce a new idea from something we heard, or simply just adding layers on top of things, slowly removing the layers from the bottom so those instruments can be repurposed to build on top of. It is a song that continues to grow and expand in congruent ways that push the song forward rather than redirect it into an entirely different direction. It unfortunately misses a lot of the melodic elements and melodic depth that I've enjoyed across the album, but it excels in a different realm that I've been wishing the album did as well. So I'm kind of torn on it. I liked my time with it, and I was really happy to hear this cohesion, but I did miss some of the classical melody composition that was present everywhere else. Every other song, the six that precede it, all focused on strong melody writing and melody complexity, and then we just got very minimal amounts of it here, and it feels like a monkey paws wish where I was like, I want more cohesion, and so they gave me a fully cohesive song but stripped away my favorite part of the album to give it to me. Oh man, that's a genie's wish right there. Give me exactly what I want in the way I don't want it. Let me look at some lyrics for these last two tracks. I don't think I have anything else to add to either of these. I'll try to wrap up my thoughts on the album as a whole, but so far I kind of feel like I feel about the album the same way I felt about that first track. There's a lot of really cool ideas in here. Aside from the lyrical connections across most of the songs, though, speaking about Nostradamus, I really don't see a lot of connectivity between the individual tracks. It just feels like a series of really cool ideas, which, like I said earlier, for a debut album, it's honestly fantastic. And dude, Chapter 5, Lost, Robin Song. I do like this. Spotify has the chapter number in parentheses as a subtitle, but what is this? Genius has the chapter at the beginning with a colon after it and then the title. I like that a lot better. It also lists Midnight Gathering as an outro. Outro's put in quotation, not quotations, parentheses afterwards. I think that works really well. It doesn't list 3 and 5 as interludes, but I don't know. I'm still pretty sure about that. Oh yeah. Lyrics for Lost. I think we return to Nostradamus late in his life, full of sorrow and pain, afraid to be around anybody in fear that they will drain him of sorrow. Suddenly, without any notice, he can just get a vision about something, someone, some group of people, and it just pains him constantly to see this carnage, this wreckage that humans are capable of. And he says every time it's due to the ones who fear. He says, I see visions, I'm carrying away the ones I love. Now I'm angry about the ones above. That, I think, could be two meanings. It could be the God who put this power into him, or it could also just be those who rule, who allow all this to happen, or possibly as often as he sees in his visions, the ones who instigate it. After all, many of the things that we have seen earlier were about religious institutions who were at the height of their power enacting this pain and torture and murder. And he says there's no warning to any of it, no sign, just fear. And I just feel darkness inside, lost without a chance to hide. And then he just talks about how endless it is. He says, "See me down on the ground, hoping that nobody hears the sound of my falling tears. Endless bleeding, endless weeping, endless mourning. To be pained with the power of premonition to see all the worst things that will happen in the future." What a terrible, terrible ability. I mean, yeah, it could be used for good, 100%. But one person can't do that. I mean, he was born in Notre Dame, which I'm pretty sure, I could be way off on this. I'm pretty sure that's in Europe, right? What if I mean, he saw premonitions of the Salem witch trial. That's America. How is he ever going to stop that? What if he sees premonitions in Japan, China, Russia, India, parts of Africa, parts of South America, 1500s when he was born? I mean, he's seeing stuff in places where the civilization that's going to do it don't exist yet. Right? The Salem witch trials, 1500s. We're talking about Native Americans still being the predominant group on North America. There's no way he can stop this. It happened so late after his time. All he can do is feel the pain of it. I mean, that's just a heartbreaking song. And like I said, it's done to a rock ballad. It's the first track that I think predominantly revels in this somber, I don't even want to say darkness. It's a medium amount of feeling. It's not depressive. It's just somber. It's just bleak. It's the first time I think where the musical atmosphere really matches what's being told lyrically. And for it to be the peak, the head that this entire story is pushed towards, yeah, there's a lot of emotional weight to this track in isolation, but within the larger context of the album, it's just even heavier. And he knows it doesn't end. It's endless bleeding, endless weeping. But I think it's interesting that that can take on two ideas too. It's not so much that he continues to see this pain and suffering, that these visions are endless. He will have to die to stop seeing them, but also, again, the perpetuation of the history of violence. No matter what, whether his vision is for tomorrow, next year, next decade, next century, next millennia, he still sees pain and bleeding and weeping and mourning. Humans are terrible to each other. Dang. I mean, that's just. That is a really strong way to contextualize this. And granted, again, I don't think that this is a totally fictional, grounded version of Nostradamus. I don't think he had visions of the future. I don't know how accurate his prophecies have been, but if they were accurate, I don't know if they were quite like this, where he would be basically, a 1500s Jean Grey, a psychic with the ability. No, Jean Grey doesn't see the future. Oh, sometimes she does. Are there any mutants in the Marvel world that have like future seeing? I don't know. Jean Grey has on time, so I'm going to stick with that. Sometimes she's able to see the future. But what I'm saying is it takes on a bit more of a supernatural role. But I think it's still, for a person who had made so many prophecies about pain and suffering, it was something that was on his mind often. And I think this is a fantastic way to contextualize that. Though I am curious if he was well aware of sometimes how accurate his prophecies could be. and knowing that it wasn't just the concept of pain and suffering, but actual events that were going to be painful for people. So yeah, Midnight Gathering feels very metatextual. There's really two ideas here. The first stanza says, "In the woods we met you. We don't know who you are, but take your fiddle and come over, sit down around the fireplace." Then we have the middle two stanzas, which pretty much say the same thing. The flames are rising so high they long for the sky. Heroes will be awakened in elder stories, let the spirits fly. The idea that as we tell these stories, we awaken the characters within them. Then we sandwich this and we bring back another piece of bread. It says, "In the woods we met you, stranger." Although this time, instead of saying, "Come take a seat," we're telling stories, it says it's time to say goodbye. Like all the stars that lead the blind, we're hiding with the morning rise. That's the whole song. It almost feels as if to say, this was all a story. Some of it may be true, some of it may be a bit fictionalized, embellished upon, but this is one of the stories we can tell around fireplaces. This is the story of Nostradamus, and we tell it through music, and we tell it through word, and at the end of the night, as the sun rises, we all leave. I don't really know how to feel about this. I was not expecting this meta component to it. Because one, it does set up sort of this frame story. Where we have a group of people telling a story of Nostradamus. And the pain and suffering he endured because of his visions. And then at the end, bam. Now we're back to the fireplace and they say this, the sun's up. Let's go home. We'll do this again another night. We'll tell some more stories. But on the other hand, it's not really set up to be a frame story. And I find these to be... it's hit and miss. To have the audience think that they're watching things in real time, only for the very end to say, actually, this was a story within a story. Sometimes this is very miss, like with, dang, what is that really old hospital show? This is going to be a bit of a spoiler, but like, dude, this came out in the 60s, so I think the timeline for spoiler tags is way over. Anyways, the show went on for several seasons, multiple years, and then at the end we found out that the whole story of this hospital and the relationships of all these people were inside the mind of somebody in a coma, and then they woke up at the end of the series. Yeah, like that's not a fun way to end that. Um, and that's kind of how I feel about this. Although maybe less annoyed about it and just kind of perplexed. It's an interesting little twist, but I don't really think it adds to anything. I think it would have been neater, maybe, to start the album off with, "Hey, we met. Hey, stranger, come over here. We're telling stories. Listen to this one about the man who could see the future," and then move into the album, and then end with this. Our story's over. We come here once a week. Drop by another time. Maybe you'll be less of a stranger then, right? That kind of vibe. But to end on it, to just randomly come into this second layer of narrative, I don't know, it feels weird. But it also pulls me in as a sort of a credits, an end scene. Like after you watch a movie, the camera pans over to the film crew and they're like, "Thanks for watching. We put a lot of hard work into this. We hope you enjoyed it." Because it almost feels like the band, Haggard, are the minstrels here. And they're speaking directly to me. "Hey, we tell stories here. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hope you come by again." That kind of vibe. It's that metatextual element there that I feel kind of mixed about. I think it's because meta stuff is just so common today, it's becoming a bit tiresome. But in 97, this would have been really mind blowing. So I don't know. I mean, I suppose the other way to read it is in text, and Nostradamus ended up in this forest, but that it feels way too different musically, lyrically, the way that it's written, the way the prose is done, the way it's performed. It's too separate from the rest of the album for me to really read it that way, and it doesn't add anything either. For the Nostradamus to have his mental breakdown and then end up in a forest and listen to songs by a bunch of you know, pagan bards. So it really doesn't work 100% on any level, and I think that's what kind of makes me ambivalent towards it. It's a fine song. It's just such an odd way to end this album, especially since it ditches all the musical ideas that they've presented. And I kind of gave chapter 5 a little bit of a pass for that because what they achieved through that, the stronger cohesion between theme, musical theme and lyrical theme, I think it far outweighs the idea that we kind of gave up some of the writing along the way to achieve this. But a Midnight Gathering, I don't think adds anything to anything by existing. And I think if it had been removed entirely, Chapter 5 is a fantastic way to end the album. And I think that's really the best metric for it. Does the album work fine without it? Yeah. Is it improved? I also think, yes, it ends on a really heavy note with a poignant message about humanity and history and the cycle of violence that we continue to perpetuate on each other. And then to end on something a bit brighter, it just softens the punch, I think, in a way that isn't great. Sometimes telling a really heavy message and then providing some aftercare is nice. I don't think that this message was heavy enough to really warrant that. It just felt like a good place to end it and a good message to end on. And it didn't feel like it was trying to rip my heart apart with it as much as just tell this message, to get this message across that we need to be better to each other. Those are my thoughts. And Thou Shalt Trust the Seer by Haggard. Let me know what you thought of this one. If there was anything that stood out to you, anything you'd like to add on to what I said, correct me on, just have your own thoughts, opinions, or perspectives on this one. Put all that stuff down in the comments section. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. It takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. All right, that wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have a live stream. We're going to do the first live stream of May. If you don't know what those are, we just chill, hang out for like 2 hours. Chat is really casual. The analysis is a bit less deep, but I still give my thoughts on some music, and it's a good way to get some more obscure stuff out there. Stuff that might not be good for a full analysis, or just bands, songs that just aren't that popular. Just an easy way to check out some cool stuff. And yeah, we just chit chat for a couple hours and listen to good music. So it is a fun, laid back experience. Just drop on by. You can even lurk if you want. You don't have to chat, you can just watch. Watch and listen, enjoy the company and the vibes. And then Monday, of course, we'll be back 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with next week's theme, which I don't remember what it is. So that's a surprise for everybody. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.